I'm Mary, and I would want to share with you a tale about something that occurred in my family. It's difficult to discuss, but I hope you will pay attention. Richard, whom I married 5 years ago, is a decent man who works hard. When I became his stepmother, Richard's son David was 17 years old. At first, we didn't chat much because he was quiet, and I didn't want to push him because I felt he needed some time to get used to me. David lived with us because his mother passed away when he was little. Richard worked long hours, so David and I spent a lot of time at home together. I tried to take care of him, cook for him, and make the house feel warm. One day, I asked him how was school today. David, he looked at me and said it was fine. That's all, he didn't say more. I smiled and said, okay, if you ever want to talk, I am here. He nodded and went to his room. Days turned into months, and slowly, David began to open up. He started telling me about school, his friends, and the things he liked. I was happy to listen. I wanted him to feel like he had someone he could trust, but then something changed. One evening we were eating dinner. Richard was away on a work trip. David looked at me and said, "You are very kind to me." I laughed a little and said, "Of course, David, I care about you." He looked at me for a long time. His eyes were soft but serious. I felt nervous, but I didn't understand why. "What's wrong, David?" I asked. He shook his head and said, "Nothing." After that night, things felt different. David started spending more time with me. He would sit close when we watched TV or help me with chores around the house. I thought he just wanted to be nice, but sometimes the way he looked at me made me feel strange. I told myself it's nothing, he's just a boy, but deep inside I felt uneasy. One night Richard was out late, and David and I sat in the living room talking. He told me about his mother. "I miss her so much." He said she was the only one who really understood me. I was sad for him, so I reached out and held his hand and said, "I'm sorry, David. She would be proud of the man you are becoming." He asked, "Do you really think?" And I replied, "Yes." He looked at me again with those serious eyes, and I couldn't sleep that night because I kept thinking about David and the way he looked at me. I told myself, you are his stepmother, you love Richard. I tried to keep things normal, cleaned the house, made sure David was okay, and made sure he was okay, but deep down I was confused. David was kind, and he helped me with little things. If I dropped something, he would pick it up right away, and if I was tired, he would tell me to relax. "I'll take care of this one day." One day, when I was in the kitchen cooking, David asked if I needed assistance. As we worked side by side, I grinned and said, "Sure, you can cut the vegetables." I was glad to have someone by my side, but David stopped cutting and turned to face me. His eyes were gentle, as if he were trying to convey a significant message. "What is it, David?" he remarked quietly. I didn't know what to say, but my heart felt warm, but also scared. I begged him to make this house feel like home, and he replied, "Thank you. I'm delighted you feel that way." David began spending more time with me following that day. He would sit close to me if I was sitting on the couch, and he would come outside to talk to me if I was in the garden. He always had something nice to say. "Mary," he once told me, "I wish my mom could have met you." His words made me feel special, but they also left me perplexed. I wasn't sure if I was reading too much into things. He's just a boy, I told myself again, but one evening something happened that I couldn't ignore. Richard had gone out with his friends, so I was reading a book in the living room when David came and sat next to me. I asked him what he was reading, and we started talking. We laughed about some of the story's funny parts, which made me feel comfortable, but then David put his hand on mine, and I froze. He looked at me and said, "I just want to thank you, you've been so kind to me." I gently withdrew my hand, and he said, "You don't need to thank me." I tried to grin as I answered, "David, we're family," but deep down I knew something wasn't right. I went to bed early that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about David's hand on mine. Was it a friendly gesture or something else entirely? I prayed it was nothing. I told myself, "You're overthinking, it's all innocent," but deep down I knew things were changing. The days after that night felt strange. I tried to act normal, but things didn't feel the same. I avoided being alone with David as much as I could. I told myself it was better this way. But David didn't seem to notice. He still found ways to be close. If I was in the kitchen, he would come and talk to me. If I was folding laundry, he would sit nearby and help. It was hard to ignore him. But I tried my best. One afternoon Richard was working late again. I was cleaning the living room when David came in. "Do you need help, Mary?" he asked. "No, I'm fine," I said quickly. I didn't want him to stay, but he didn't leave. Instead he sat on the couch and watched me. "You're always so busy," he said. "You never rest." I smiled a little and said, "There's always something to do in the house." He stood up and walked over to me. "You do so much for us," he said. "You make this house feel alive." Thank you, David." I tried to speak steadily, but then he did something unexpected. He stroked my shoulder. It wasn't a very large gesture, but it made my heart rush. I firmly stepped back and asked, "What are you doing?" David turned to face me. His eyes were filled with emotion as he said, "I don't know how to say this, but I care more about you than I should." I froze, my head spinning. David swiftly responded, "You can't talk like that, I'm your stepmother." Even though I know it's bad, I can't stop feeling as though my breath has been taken away. I was too startled to move, and I wanted to flee to put an end to this, but I was at a loss for words. "David, this must end." I finally told him, "This is not right. I love your father, and I care about you like a son." He nodded, but his expression was wounded. "I'm sorry," he whispered quietly. "I just wanted to let you know that I left the room and locked myself in my bedroom." My hands were shaking, and I couldn't believe what had happened. Richard and how much he trusted me were on my mind all the time. Even though I hadn't done anything wrong that night, I felt like I had let him down because I couldn't sleep and kept thinking about what David had said. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I tell Richard or should I ignore it and hope it never happened again? I chose to keep quiet, telling myself it was just a phase of confusion for David and that he would move on, but deep down I wasn't sure. After that day, I tried to avoid David as much as possible because I didn't want to talk to him or spend time alone with him. I convinced myself that if I kept my distance, things would return to normal, but David made things difficult. One evening when Richard was home and I felt safe, we had dinner together. David was quiet, but I could feel his eyes on me, so I avoided looking at him and tried to act normal. After dinner, Richard went to his study to work, so I stayed in the kitchen cleaning up. David came in and stood by the door, and I pretended not to notice him. "Mary," he said softly. I didn't answer, I kept washing the dishes. "Mary, I'm sorry for what I said earlier. I didn't want to upset you." I turned to him and told him, "David, this is not something we can talk about. It's wrong, and it has to stop." "I know," he said that with sadness in his voice. "I simply don't know how to get over these feelings." For the first time, I noticed how much he was struggling. He wasn't attempting to harm me or cause trouble, he was just as confused as I was. "David," I gently said, "this isn't good for you or for me. You need to find a way to move past this. You're a smart, kind young man, you have your whole life ahead of you." He nodded but said nothing, and then he left the kitchen. I took a deep breath, hoping that this would be the last time, but it wasn't. A few days later, Richard had to leave for a business trip, and I was anxious about spending time alone in the house with David, but I wasn't sure how to stop it. I couldn't tell Richard what he would think of me. When David knocked on my bedroom door that evening, I didn't answer Mary. Instead, he said, "I just want to talk, go to bed, David." I firmly said, and after a brief period of silence, he said, "I'm sorry for everything." I felt guilty for not responding, and eventually I heard him leave that evening. I sat on my bed feeling helpless because I loved Richard, and I wanted our family to be happy, but I had no idea how to make David's feelings better, and my silence was only making things worse. I began to question whether I should tell Richard the truth, but what would happen if I did? Would he blame me or become upset with David? The idea of severing our family was too much to handle, so I kept quiet. I told myself that this was the right thing to do, but I knew in my heart that keeping quiet was only making things more difficult. Every little thing David did seemed to have a hidden meaning, such as a longer look, a softer tone, or the way he tried to be close to me. Richard's trip lasted a few days, and I was on edge the entire time. I kept busy around the house to avoid any chance to be alone with David because I thought that if I remained strong and distant, everything would settle down. One evening as I was sitting in the garden, the frigid air made me feel as though I was walking on thin ice, and I reasoned that it would help me decompress. I was deep in contemplation as I gazed at the flowers when I heard Mary David say something quietly behind me. I turned to see him standing there with his hands in his pockets. I sighed. "What is it, David? Can we talk just for a minute?" He replied, "I didn't want to, but I agreed. Okay, what do you want to say?" He took a seat beside me on the bench, but he kept a safe distance. "I've been thinking a lot," and he started by saying, "I know I've made things difficult for you. I didn't mean to." I remained silent to give him space to speak. He added, staring at the ground, "I just don't know how to stop feeling what I feel, but I don't want to hurt you or Dad." I felt a mixture of exasperation and grief. "David, you need to comprehend something." He nodded but didn't look at me when I said, "I've tried," but he said, "But it's hard." "I know it's hard," I said, "but it's the right thing to do. You're a good person." I said softly, "I love your father, he's a good man, and I want us to be a happy family. What you're feeling is normal for someone your age, but you need to let it go. You'll find someone who shares your feelings, David, but it won't be me." I wanted to think that this was the end of it, so I locked my bedroom door again that night because I was scared of what might happen if I didn't. I didn't want to think that David would do anything wrong, but I also didn't trust the situation. We sat in silence for a long time, and I hoped that my words would help him understand. When Richard came home that evening, I felt a wave of safety wash over me. I wanted to tell him everything, but I couldn't find the courage, because I didn't want to ruin the peace we had that night. As I lay in bed with Richard, I realized I couldn't keep this secret forever. The silence was tearing me apart, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold it in. The silence was heavy on my heart, and I couldn't sleep that night, even with Richard by my side. After breakfast the following morning, I decided to ask Richard if we could talk, because it was crucial. He looked surprised, but accepted, and we sat in the living room. David had left, so it was just the two of us, and I could hardly look at him because my hands were shaking. "Richard, I started to tell you something," but his expression darkened. "What is it, Mary?" I took a deep breath and said, "It's about David." He leaned forward, clearly worried, and said, "What about him?" "He's okay, yes, he's okay, but it's been difficult for me too." I told him everything, including how David had been acting strangely, how he had said things that made me uncomfortable, and how I had tried to handle it on my own. I didn't blame David, but I also didn't hide the truth. Richard listened without interjecting, his face changing from confusion to anger to sadness. When I was done, he sat back and rubbed his face with his hands. "I can't believe this," he said softly. Richard looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know how to tell you that I didn't want to hurt you." I was crying. His eyes were filled with pain. "You should have told me sooner, Mary, so I could have helped." I was afraid, so I said, "I didn't want to ruin our family." Richard nodded slowly, "But we need to fix this." Later that day, when David got home, Richard called him into the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, my heart pounding, and I couldn't make out what they were saying. After a while, Richard came to me. He looked calm but tired. He said, "David knows what he did wrong. He's going to stay with his aunt for a while, to give us all some space." I felt both relieved and sad. "Do you think he'll be okay?" That night, as Richard and I sat together, he held my hand and said, "We'll get through this together." I looked at him and nodded yes, and with that, I knew our family had taken the first step toward healing. I asked Richard if he would need time, and he replied that he's young, he'll learn, and he'll move on. I nodded, feeling the weight lifted off my shoulders for the first time in weeks.